Hello everyone, my name is Brendan Marr. That noise you're hearing is my ventilator. And welcome to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. Today I'd like to talk about the Star Wars prequels, particularly in retrospect. Now I've talked about this before, but today I want to talk about what it might have been that has caused an evolution in attitudes toward the Star Wars Prequel Trilogy. You remember, I'm sure, years ago, when the Star Wars prequels were on the forefront of every discussion involving Star Wars, how much they were hated. Now, some of you might be saying, well, aren't they still hated? Well, oddly enough, not as much. Now, let me take a step back and say I am referring to the online discourse. Now, as we know, online discourses are not always reflective of the entire attitude of the fandom. I made this very clear on my podcast on Tuesday, that those online, like myself, do not represent every fan. In fact, we're a small group. That being said, when you go online, when you go to Twitter, Instagram, the comment section on YouTube, you begin to see that there is a lot more positivity toward the Star Wars Prequel Trilogy than there has ever been. Why is that? Well, let me get this one out of the way first. The elephant in the room. It's probably because the prequels were then and the sequels are now. And it is more popular, more common to hate on the current trilogy because it is going on right now. It's done now. But because it was only within the last few years, starting in The Last Jedi and onward, everything has been very divisive. The negativity online toward those films is big because they are on our minds right now. You know, the prequel trilogy ended 15 years ago. So they're in the rearview mirror. So time, I think, as it put them far enough behind us, that they are not the focus of every online rage. Another reason is, I think, with the new trilogy, with George Lucas being gone from creating Star Wars, some fans feel, and this could be a legitimate discussion, that it is lacking a singular vision. Now, that's a discussion that could take a whole episode. Now, you remember that George Lucas, not too long ago, was public enemy number one for Star Wars fans. When The Force Awakens was coming out, and when it came out, there was a feeling, I think, that This is going to be the movie that's going to correct George Lucas's mistakes. Or make Star Wars good again. Okay. Yet again, an entire episode could be spent on that. And I think for a brief time there was a feeling that Star Wars had gotten over the stink of the prequels. Because The Force Awakens had been well received. Followed by Rogue One. Okay. That's another possibility. But I think that we now have reached a point, I think particularly with the discourse discussing whether or not there was a plan for the sequel trilogy, there is a feeling among many fans, at least online, that the sequel trilogy is lacking a guiding hand. Like George Lucas, that is the one guiding the story. Now, not too long ago, we were complaining about George Lucas not being very collaborative with others to make Star Wars. So I think what we need to keep in mind is that many fans now are behaving toward J.J. Abrams, Kathleen Kennedy, Rian Johnson, so on and so forth, the same way they were behaving to George Lucas not very long ago. But as I said, I think all of these, to sum it up, are because the prequels were then, the sequels are now. It's much easier to be negative and rant and rave about what's going on right now than what happened almost 20 years ago. Okay, so time is one of them. Is one of the reasons. I also think there is a generation that grew up with the prequels. The prequels being their first exposure to Star Wars. Now, there are some kids of that generation who do not like the prequels. And that's fine. And yet there are many who do. So there is a generation that's coming out and saying, hey, that's my Star Wars. So time, because it's popular to criticize the current movies. A generation. Another reason could be that the Clone Wars animated series was well received and well liked by many fans. Now, as I talked about before, when it started, my goodness, the reaction was pretty bad. But as the show, and I have to agree actually, that the Clone Wars started out really badly. But as the show progressed and evolved, and as fans finally got to see it and started, even those who may have missed it on TV, started watching it once it was on Netflix, I think the Clone Wars series was able to flesh out some of the things that didn't work out in the prequels. And also to provide good content based on the prequels that was well received by fans. And so I think when many fans look back now at the prequels, or fans that are in love with the Clone Wars series, they look back and are able to see the story that George Lucas was trying to tell in a different way. Now, about 6 years ago, Joseph Scrimshaw from Force Center appeared on Jedi Alliance on the Popcorn Talk YouTube network to defend the Star Wars prequels. And a lot of people at that time started to go, you know what? I am feeling a change of heart toward the prequels. A lot of people, there were several kinds of people. There were the people who, like me, really had to go back and really give some thought and kind of re-examine the prequels and focus more on what I enjoyed about them over what I didn't. And Scrimshaw, and thank you, Joseph, if you're listening, really pointed out a lot of ideas that are like, there's a lot of thought there. There's a lot of things there that really add layers to the whole Star Wars story. And I think Joseph and others really help people come to grips with their feelings about it. So there were people who re-examined the prequels. There were people who always liked them, but were afraid to say anything because of the negativity. And there were people who they always loved them and were always outspoken about their love for them and felt more comfortable with that once they realized there were lots of like-minded people. And a generation. So there's a lot of reasons in that regard. And another thing I think is there is a feeling among some that the prequels were made by a singular vision and that the sequels were made by committee. And I don't know if I agree with that. But it is an interesting thing to think about. There are certain movies nowadays, and I guess there have always been, that when you look at them, you say, this feels like it had a lot of people's hands in it. In terms of, let's do this, and this, and this, and this. But the idea is coming from various, producers, the studio, the director, and it just becomes a jumbled mess that feels like it was made by a committee and not by a person. Whereas many fans, and I don't know if I agree, but feel that the prequels were at least had the hand of one person on them. Now then again, as I mentioned earlier, there is still, and there was then, a lot of discussion about, does George Lucas have too much power when it comes to making Star Wars because no one can tell him no. That was a common refrain. So there are many, many reasons why attitudes toward the prequels have evolved. As I said, it could be time. It could be the Clone Wars series. It could be generational. It could be a feeling of the singular vision of George Lucas. There are so many reasons why attitudes toward the prequels have changed. But it is a very interesting thing, and I know that there are a lot of fans out there whose attitudes toward the prequels have never changed, and they still don't like them even to this day, and that is totally fine. But it is very fascinating to me that there are many people, particularly in our online world right now, which can be such a negative place, to oddly enough find such positivity about the prequels, a positivity that is unprecedented. And I am going to suggest to you that in 20 years, attitudes toward the sequel trilogy are going to be much more positive than they are now. I'm not willing to bet money on that, but I just get the feeling that time and generations and other content are going to change our attitudes. And many fans who love the sequel trilogy, who grew up with it as kids, like the kids that are the age group of my nephews and my niece, are going to be like, hey, that's our Star Wars. So I think that we're going to see the same pattern repeated. And I certainly hope that that's what happens, because I believe, just in my own opinion, that this sequel trilogy and these movies have been marvelous. So those are my thoughts on the prequels in retrospect. Now, many of you listening, I'm sure, have very strong opinions about the prequels. And that's fine. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there are many people whose attitudes have changed and who are very positive for the prequels. And many of them are so positive it even baffles me. But I am glad to see that the love for the prequels has grown. And I hope love grows for the sequel trilogy as well. My name is Brennan Mara. That noise you hear is with that later. And thank you for tuning in to Page Turners They Were Not, my Star Wars podcast. May the Force be with you.